The parking lot at Riverside Community Hospital stretched empty under Colorado Springs' November sky, rain coming down in sheets that turned the asphalt into a mirror. Katie Rodriguez sat in her 10-year-old Subaru for 7 minutes before she opened the door. Her hands were steady. That was the problem. Steady hands meant muscle memory. Muscle memory meant Kandahar was still living in her nervous system, and she'd come here to bury it. She walked through the employee entrance at 11:47 p.m., badge clipped to scrubs that hung loose on her frame. Second week. 14 days since she'd applied under her grandmother's maiden name, since she'd cut her hair short and let it go grey at the temples, since she'd become someone the world had never heard of. The intake nurse hadn't asked about the 8-month gap on her resume. Nobody did when you worked nights at a hospital that had been understaffed for 3 years running. They just needed bodies. Katie needed invisibility. The night shift smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical hum above the mostly empty third-floor medical surgical ward. She clocked in and found her assignment on the whiteboard: 14 patients, 2 floors, skeleton crew. One of those nurses was Dr. Marcus Blackwell, the chief of internal medicine, who hadn't slept in his office tonight like usual. Instead, he was moving through the medication room at 12:17 a.m., a chart in one hand and a syringe in the other, his movements precise and practiced in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. Katie recognized it immediately. The calculation. The deliberation. The way his fingers paused before entering dosage changes into the electronic system. 3 patients. Dilaudid, reduced by 40% from what the attending physician had ordered. Fentanyl, bumped up by 20%. Methadone, quantity increased without corresponding documentation. She stood in the hallway, pretending to review her own patient charts, her body language loose and forgettable. Just another tired night shift nurse who wouldn't make eye contact. But her mind was cataloging. That was the problem with 8 years of combat medicine. You never stopped seeing patterns. Threats. Sequences. The story a room was trying to tell you in the space between what people said and what they actually did. Blackwell's presence moved past her like a tank idling in a garage, controlled power, expensive cologne, the weight of someone accustomed to compliance. He didn't acknowledge her. Nobody on the day shift had either, except to point her towards supply closets and time clocks. She was good at being invisible. She'd trained for it her entire career, just never in a hospital. The next morning, the restrictions came quietly. Katie arrived at 11 p.m. on Thursday to find her access badge had been reprogrammed. The cardiac intensive care wing was now restricted. The trauma observation room, locked. A printed memo in her cubby stated that all medication pools would now require supervisor sign-off, effective immediately. Hospital policy update. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would warrant questions. But that wasn't what made Katie's jaw tighten as she read the email from administration confirming her reassignment to exclusively overnight shifts. That wasn't the real move. The real move was the message underneath, the signal that someone had noticed her noticing something. The strategic retreat before she could gather evidence. The calculation that a new nurse on nights, isolated from the day staff who might actually listen, would be easy to neutralize. She clipped the tarnished military challenge coin to her ID badge that night, a habit she'd sworn she'd broken in Kandahar. The coin had been fashioned from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel by her unit medic, Sergeant Raymond Graves, 12 years ago. She'd kept it in her wallet ever since, tucked behind her driver's license under the name Catherine Rodriguez, grandmother's surname, new woman entirely. Now it caught the overhead light as she moved through the 3rd floor, a small piece of metal that meant nothing to anyone who saw it. To Katie, it meant everything. Patient rounds moved like a ritual. Room 314, Mr. Patterson, 71, post-op hip replacement, vital stable. Room 315, Mrs. Chen, diabetic, blood sugar managed. Room 316, Mr. Wallace, orthopedic trauma, came in 2 weeks ago with a compound fracture of the tibia and fibula. He was the one who noticed. He called her over at 2:34 a.m., his voice low, his eyes sharper than any 78-year-old should have been. He'd been watching her work, the precise angle of her hands as she adjusted his suture line, the way her fingers moved like someone performing a technique she'd done 5,000 times before. Not a nurse's hands. Someone else's hands. "Where do you really serve?" His words were barely a whisper, his weathered face creased with recognition that made Katie's breath catch for one moment. Just one. She didn't let it show. He continued before she could answer, his voice barely audible above the ventilator's hiss in the adjacent room. "I was Army medic. Fort Bragg. 1991 to 1995. I know that technique. Army Special Operations taught us that suture pattern. You didn't learn that here." Katie didn't flinch. She finished adjusting his bandage, her movements unchanged, her breathing unchanged. When she spoke, her voice was exactly what it had been all week, deferential, soft, the voice of someone trying very hard not to take up space. "You're remembering your training, Mr. Wallace. Sometimes muscle memory gets confused about where it comes from." But she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't confused. He'd served. He knew the difference between a civilian nurse and someone who'd spent years closing wounds in combat theaters. The difference was in the hands. The difference was in the lack of hesitation. The next 3 hours passed in careful routine. Vital signs. Medication rounds. She stayed in the eastern wing, away from the medication room where Blackwell had been, away from the areas where he'd already established control. But she'd already seen what she needed to see. The pattern was clear. The dosages were changing. The documentation was forged. And somewhere in this hospital, Dr. Marcus Blackwell had decided that a controlled substance redistribution operation was more important than the 4 patients whose medications he was systematically altering. At 4:47 a.m., during the shift's deepest quiet, Katie accessed the medication room. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her badge was flagged now. But night shifts meant skeleton crews, and skeleton crews meant gaps. She reviewed the digital log of every medication pulled, every dosage, every timestamp. Blackwell's signature on entries he hadn't documented. Quantity discrepancies of 340 units of Dilaudid over the past 6 weeks. Fentanyl patches, 15 of them, marked as waste but never actually destroyed. $240,000. Maybe more. Wholesale value of the diverted narcotics, if they were being moved to distribution. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't a moment of weakness. That was her operation. That was someone who'd been doing this for months, maybe longer, with the institutional power of a chief of medicine backing him. And that was when Katie understood what had happened. Blackwell hadn't restricted her access because he'd noticed her that first night. He'd restricted her access because he had to. Because on her second shift, she'd been assigned to help reconcile the medication inventory. Because the timing had made her dangerous. Because even though she'd been invisible, she'd been scheduled to see exactly what she'd seen anyway, and he'd had to move fast to contain it. The question was whether he'd moved fast enough. She clipped her badge back to her scrubs, the tarnished challenge coin catching the light one more time, and walked back into the hallway just as the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum above the mostly empty ward. Patient rounds continued. Vitals remained stable. The night moved forward in its prescribed rhythm. But at 5:12 a.m., from his office 1 floor below, Dr. Marcus Blackwell made his first call to the hospital administrator. And that call changed everything. Dr. Blackwell gathered the entire day's shift in the break room during Thursday morning rounds, his voice carrying across the tables like a tank idling in a garage. Katie poured coffee with her back turned, her shoulders tensing as his words filled the fluorescent-lit space. "I'm making a public prediction," he announced, looking directly at her reflection in the stainless steel coffee pot. "Our newest nurse, let's call her Ghost, since she barely speaks, will quit within 1 week. I'll bet anyone here $50 she doesn't last until next Monday." Laughter rippled through the room. Someone snorted. A resident grinned. The coffee maker hissed as she finished pouring, the steam rising between her and the assembled crowd like a curtain she could hide behind. But Katie didn't hide. She turned slowly, her eyes moving from face to face, then settling on Blackwell's with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. When she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, each word fell like a scalpel. "I've seen braver men bleed out quietly." She walked past him into the hallway, her footsteps steady and measured on the tile floor. Behind her, the break room fell into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The coffee maker continued its mechanical breathing, the only sound in a room that had forgotten how to function. Blackwell's jaw tightened. His hand curled into a fist at his side. He wasn't used to being answered. He was used to watching people crumble under pressure, used to watching their eyes fill with tears, used to watching them apologize for things they hadn't done. But Katie's composure, that flat, cold stare that never wavered, that jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle working beneath her skin, it had landed something in him. Something that felt dangerously close to fear. He pushed the feeling down and made a second decision that would prove far more consequential than the first. 3 days later, Katie was halfway through her lunch in the hospital cafeteria, sitting at a table near the window with a salad and a bottle of water, when Blackwell approached from behind. The cafeteria was crowded, at least 70 staff members scattered across the space, nurses and orderlies and administrative staff all breaking bread during the chaos of midday rounds. He approached her table with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences. His hand reached out as he passed her shoulder, his timing deliberate, his movement angled to look accidental. The tray clattered to the floor. Soup splashed across her scrubs in a wide stain. Bread scattered. The plastic cup rolled under a nearby table. Dozens of people turned to look. Some gasped. One orderly half rose from his seat as if to help, then sat back down, sensing the temperature in the room had shifted. "So clumsy, Ghost," Blackwell said loudly, his voice pitched to carry. "Maybe nursing isn't your calling after all." He smiled at the crowd, waiting for agreement, waiting for the laughter that would validate him. Some staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few looked away. Nobody laughed. Katie knelt slowly, gathering the mess with deliberate movements, her breathing steady and controlled. She picked up the scattered vegetables one at a time. She wiped the soup from the floor with a napkin. She retrieved the cup. And the entire time, the room watched her in a silence so thick you could operate in it. When she stood, holding the mess in her hands, she turned to face him. Her eyes met his with the precision of a targeting laser. When she spoke, that same quiet voice, each word landed like a punch. "Your insecurity is showing, doctor." Then she walked to the trash receptacle, disposed of the ruined lunch, and headed toward the locker room, her jaw clenched so tight a vein pulsed in her temple like a second heartbeat. Blackwell stood frozen in the center of the cafeteria, surrounded by people who were no longer looking at him. They were looking past him, at the empty space where she'd been. The silence felt like a weight. The following morning during patient rounds, Katie was charting vital signs outside room 307 when Blackwell appeared around the corner. He held a patient chart in his hand, the chart for the post-operative hernia repair in 307. He didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He simply threw it at her feet in the hallway, hard enough that it hit the tile floor with an audible slap. 3 nurses and an orderly watched from various points along the corridor. The chart scattered, pages spreading across 5 feet of floor space. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice pitched to carry. "And next time, try reading the orders correctly. I know literacy can be challenging for some people." He smiled that smile again, the one that had worked so many times before on so many people who couldn't afford to talk back. Katie stared at him for 5 full seconds without moving. Her hands remained perfectly still at her sides. Her breathing didn't change. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that the nurses down the hall had to strain to hear it. "I read them," she said. "I also read what you changed at 2 a.m. She bent down, gathered the scattered pages with methodical precision, stacked them, and handed the chart to him without breaking eye contact. For half a second, something flickered across Blackwell's face, a flash of something raw and reactive that he quickly buried beneath a smile. But Katie saw it. She'd seen that look before, worn by men who'd realized too late that they'd miscalculated who they were standing next to. She turned and walked away, leaving him frozen in the corridor with the chart in his hands and the sudden, sinking realization that whatever game he'd thought he was playing had just fundamentally changed. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed the calculation in Blackwell's mind. He stood in that hallway for nearly 2 minutes, staring at the space where Katie had been, his breathing shallow and controlled the way it becomes when a predator realizes it's no longer hunting but being hunted. He'd wanted to break her with humiliation. He'd wanted to watch her crumble, to see her cry, to witness her resignation letter being typed on a hospital computer in some locked bathroom stall. Instead, she'd looked at him the way you might look at something you'd already counted as dead. It was the worst kind of damage. The kind you can't undo. By Friday morning, Katie had begun to notice the pattern that she'd seen before, in different uniforms, in different wars. The tightening of the net. Blackwell had filed a formal complaint with hospital administration about her unauthorized medical procedures and protocol violations on Wednesday morning. He'd made calls to 3 other medical facilities in Colorado Springs, colleagues he'd built relationships with over 15 years, and in those calls he'd mentioned, almost casually, that Katie might soon be seeking employment elsewhere. He'd requested her schedule change be made permanent, arguing that overnight staffing was understaffed. He'd had Maria, the charge nurse who'd trained Katie, transferred to St. Anthony's across town, effective immediately. When Katie tried to access the medication database to cross-reference the patient files she'd memorized while watching Blackwell alter records, her login credentials had been revoked. The system showed the access removal had been processed by HR at 6:47 p.m. on Thursday, 17 minutes after Blackwell's initial conversation with the department head. During a quiet moment late Friday evening, while Katie restocked supplies in the ICU, an older man in a hospital gown appeared at the medication cart. He was 63, maybe 64, recovering from gallbladder surgery. His name was Marcus Wheeler according to the chart, and he had the careful, economical movements of someone whose body had been broken and reassembled more times than it should have been. He watched her hands as she prepared a dressing change for the patient in for 12, watched the way her fingers moved with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, watched the angle of her needle, the depth of her suture, the exact tension she held in the thread. After she finished, 6 sutures, all perfect, he caught her arm quietly. "I know that technique," he whispered. "I was a combat medic in Desert Storm. Field Surgery Battalion, 5th Corps. Spent 19 months in the Gulf." He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. "Where do you really serve?" Katie's hand stopped for half a second, one breath, barely visible, the kind of pause that would have meant nothing to most people. But Marcus Wheeler had survived 19 months as a field medic, and surviving meant noticing the things that didn't belong. Noticing the pause. Katie resumed her movements, rolling up the supply cart with careful deliberation. "I didn't," she said quietly. But Marcus didn't believe her, and more importantly, she knew he didn't. He nodded slowly, understanding that some doors weren't meant to be opened in hospital corridors, and he walked back to his room with the kind of knowing that comes from having worn the same invisible uniform she wore under her scrubs. "I need some Jell-O," Katie thought grimly as she continued her rounds, and the dark humor of it, the absurdity of that thought, the way her mind grabbed onto ordinary things when the walls were closing in, kept her moving forward. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby when the siren screamed into the ER bay at 2:34 a.m. Katie was finishing her rounds on the 3rd floor, the floors Blackwell had actually allowed her to work, when the overhead system crackled. "Trauma alert, ER bay 1, full cardiac arrest, ETA 2 minutes. She didn't move. Restricted access meant observation only, meant watching from the periphery while other nurses rushed toward the chaos. But her feet carried her downstairs anyway, muscle memory older than her anonymity pulling her toward the emergency lights. The ambulance doors burst open like a gunshot. Paramedics wheeled in a young officer in dress blues, his face already the color of fresh concrete, a dark stain spreading across his chest like spilled coffee. The patient was in full cardiac arrest. Not the kind that might respond to standard intervention. The kind that meant 90 seconds before the brain started dying. Katie stood in the doorway, watching the controlled panic unfold, 3 nurses moving like dancers, each with their role choreographed 100 times before. Colonel James Hendricks, 48, Peterson Air Force Base. His military ID lay on the side table next to his personal effects. An MRE package. Combat boots, still laced tight. The uniform of a man who'd expected to make it home. Dr. Blackwell arrived within 4 minutes, his face already flushed with the particular arrogance of someone about to be tested. He took one look at the patient's chest, the sucking wound, the pneumothorax, the blood pooling beneath the gurney like a spreading shadow, and reached for the intubation equipment with the confidence of a man who'd never had to improvise on a battlefield. His hands fumbled. The tray of instruments clattered against the tile with a sound like breaking glass. Precious seconds. The patient's oxygen sat dropping, 78%. 71%. The kind of numbers that don't come back. Katie watched from the threshold, her access restricted to observation only per Blackwell's new orders typed into the system at 11 p.m. the previous evening. She was supposed to be documentation. A witness. A ghost in her own professional emergency. The supply nurse was searching the wrong cabinet for the chest tube kit, her hands moving with increasing desperation. 60 seconds left. 55. The improvised chest seal was already forming in Katie's mind before her body moved. Not because she'd planned it. Because her hands remembered Kandahar in ways that her conscious mind had spent 8 months trying to forget. The MRE package was sturdy polymer, designed for harsh conditions and blunt impacts. Exactly the material needed. She was already moving, not running, never running, just walking forward with the precise intent that came from knowing exactly what needed to happen and exactly how long she had to make it happen. Blackwell saw her approaching and his face changed. Rodriguez, step back, you're not authorized for. His voice had that particular pitch of panic disguised as authority, the sound a man makes when he realizes he's losing control of a room. Katie ignored him. She reached the colonel's side as the monitors began their death song, that long flat tone that meant the heart had surrendered. 45 seconds. Her fingers tore open the MRE package, the plastic crinkled like dry leaves under boots, and she fashioned an improvised chest seal with movements so fast and precise they looked choreographed. She'd done this 384 times in Kandahar. Her hands didn't think. They remembered. Seal the wound. Create positive pressure. Restore the pneumatic equilibrium. 90 seconds. The entire sequence took exactly 90 seconds. The monitors changed. A single heartbeat appeared on the screen like a miracle finding its way through darkness. Then another. Then a rhythm that looked almost human. Vital signs climbing back into viable range, oxygen sat rising from 62 to 71 to 85. Blood pressure rebuilding. The patient's chest rising and falling with the steady breath of a man who decided to keep living. Katie stepped back from the gurney. Her hands were perfectly steady. Not trembling. Not shaking. Just there, at her sides, stained with someone else's blood and her own secret. The entire ER had gone still, the kind of silence that you can actually hear, where the ventilator seems louder than it should and every monitor beep sounds like a small bell announcing something that couldn't possibly be explained. 2 nurses stood frozen near the supply cabinet. They'd both been watching. Nurse Martinez, who'd been at Riverside for 6 years, and Keisha, newer, maybe 3 months in, still learning where everything lived in the supply room maze. Their eyes met Katie's for exactly 1 second. Long enough to know. Long enough to understand that what they'd just witnessed wasn't protocol. It wasn't textbook. It wasn't anything taught in a traditional nursing program. It was something else entirely. Blackwell's face had transformed from panic to something more complicated. Confusion mixed with something darker, the look a man gets when he realizes the woman he's been trying to destroy has just saved his patient's life in front of his entire ER team. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then he turned away, his jaw tight, his movements rigid in a way that suggested every muscle in his body had contracted simultaneously. Katie reached for a pair of gloves from the wall dispenser, her movements now perfectly calm, perfectly professional, perfectly normal. She began helping the trauma team stabilize the colonel for transport to the ICU. Blackwell didn't come back into the bay. He disappeared into his office, and everyone could feel the weight of that absence, the presence of rage and humiliation so profound that even empty air seemed to vibrate with it. Martinez and Keisha exchanged one more look as they moved supplies, worked equipment, prepared the patient for the ICU transport. The kind of look that said, "I saw that. I know what that was. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." But Katie didn't acknowledge them. She moved through the scene like a ghost, her job finished, her role complete, her secret still sitting in her chest like a stone. The paramedics arrived to transport Colonel Hendricks to the intensive care unit. As they wheeled him toward the elevator, his hand twitched, a small movement, reflexive, almost involuntary. His fingers had moved. The medical staff prepared him for the kind of recovery that probably shouldn't have been possible. Most patients with a sucking chest wound and full cardiac arrest didn't wake up. Most didn't survive. Most didn't get a second chance. Katie watched the elevator doors close. She needed some jello, she thought grimly, and the dark humor of it, the absurdity of that single ordinary thought cutting through the weight of what she'd just done, kept her moving forward. She pulled off her gloves. Washed her hands under the scalding water of the sink, watching the blood spiral down the drain in pale pink spirals. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above her head, completely indifferent to the fact that she'd just violated every protocol, revealed a fraction of her training, and changed everything in exactly 90 seconds. But that wasn't the worst part. The silence in the ER lasted exactly 4 seconds before Dr. Blackwell exploded. "Everyone out. Now." The staff scattered like startled birds, their sneakers squeaking against polished tile as he pointed directly at Katie with the precision of a man declaring war. "My office. Immediately." But his next moves revealed something far more dangerous than rage, they revealed calculation. Before Katie even left the ER floor, Blackwell pulled the 2 nurses who'd witnessed the save into the hallway. His voice dropped to something almost conversational, which made it worse. "I'm moving you both to pediatrics effective immediately. Staffing crisis." They nodded, confused, but Katie heard what wasn't said, "Witnesses removed. Evidence contained." He walked past her without looking, already typing on his tablet, the blue glow illuminating his face like something from a crime scene photograph. Within 3 minutes, he'd rewritten the entire shift schedule. Katie's next 4 rotations were overnight, isolated, scheduled to overlap with staff members who'd been transferred or were scheduled for vacation. No allies. No witnesses. No one who'd seen what she could do. He made the phone calls from his office while Katie stood in the hallway outside, close enough to hear his voice through the door but not the words, a deliberate power move. She didn't move. Didn't shift her weight. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that institutional white that made people look like ghosts. The first call was to someone at Denver General, his voice smooth and professional, problematic new hire, dangerous judgment, cowboy mentality. The second call went to a hospital board member, someone with decision-making authority. The third call went somewhere else entirely, the tone shifting slightly, more deferential. By the time he hung up, Katie's employment status wasn't just at risk, it was a controlled demolition scheduled for completion. He was making phone calls to ensure that even if she walked out of Riverside alive, no hospital in Colorado would touch her. Not without knowing exactly why. When he finally called her into his office, the chair across from his desk looked like something designed for interrogation, smaller than his, positioned lower, angled so the morning light hit her eyes while his face remained shadowed. Classic. Predictable. He sat down slowly, pressing his fingertips together in a steeple that probably worked on younger doctors or nurses who still believed in institutional authority. His voice was calm. Controlled. That made it worse than shouting. You violated direct protocol. You performed an unauthorized procedure outside your clearance level. You're terminated, effective immediately. The words landed like they were supposed to, as if they carried weight, as if they meant something. Katie could have defended herself. She could have cited the patient's vital signs, the 8 minutes until certain death, the fact that every decision she made in that moment was medically sound. But defending herself meant explaining exactly how she knew the technique. It meant explaining the years of combat trauma surgery in Kandahar, the field hospitals under fire, the fact that improvising medical solutions from whatever you had on hand wasn't a protocol violation, it was survival. It meant revealing the captain she'd buried to escape the nightmares that still woke her at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, reaching for equipment that no longer existed. She couldn't do that. Not yet. Katie simply nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble or press her hands against her thighs or do any of the things that Blackwell was clearly waiting for. She just stood up and walked toward the door. His hand shot out, pointing. He'd practiced this moment, probably rehearsed it in his mirror. I'm walking you to the front entrance. Security will meet us there. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered by someone who'd convinced himself he'd won. They walked through the hospital corridors at 4:17 in the morning, when the place was skeleton crew and the hallways echoed with their footsteps and the distant beeping of monitors counting down someone else's mortality. Blackwell made sure they passed directly in front of the security camera mounted near the ER entrance, made sure the footage would capture her departure, final proof of his victory. The automatic doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and the cold pre-dawn air hit like a physical thing. Blackwell didn't say goodbye. He just turned and walked back inside, probably already thinking about his next move, already calculating how to spin this narrative. Katie sat in her car for exactly 20 minutes in the parking lot. The engine was off. The heater wasn't running. Her hands were ice. She gripped the tarnished military challenge coin from her wallet, the metal still warm somehow, still carrying body heat from a pocket that had been closer to her heart than anything else she owned. The coin bore the emblem of her unit, 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group, and the edges were worn smooth from 8 years of deployments, from being held during impossible moments, from every time she needed to remember who she actually was. The sun was starting to break the horizon in shades of purple and orange, painting the parking lot in colors that felt wrong for a place where people came to die or be saved. She watched the hospital entrance. Watched Blackwell's car still parked in the physician's reserved spot. Watched the morning shift arrive, nurses in scrubs stepping out of their vehicles, none of them knowing what had just happened behind the doors they were about to walk through. Then she started the engine and drove across Colorado Springs to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. It took 22 minutes on Route 25, past strip malls and convenience stores that were just opening, past a breakfast place where the neon sign flickered. She didn't play music. She didn't turn on the radio. She just drove with the window cracked open, letting the cold air hit her face, letting the reality of what had happened sink in like a stone sinking through dark water. The VA hospital was a different kind of building, older, more institutional, painted that government beige that seemed designed to make people feel smaller. The automatic doors slid open and she walked through them like someone walking into surrender. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and antiseptic and something else, something metallic that she recognized as the particular exhaustion of people who'd seen things that changed them forever. The chairs were plastic and blue and occupied by veterans in various states of waiting. Some were reading outdated magazines. Some were staring at the television mounted in the corner, where the morning news played to no one. Some were just sitting, their eyes focused on something nobody else could see. Katie sank into an empty chair among them. She didn't fill out paperwork. She didn't check in at the desk. She just sat down in her scrubs that still smelled like the ER, like antiseptic and adrenaline and the particular humidity that came from working a trauma bay. The television was tuned to a news channel. The morning show was playing some human interest story about a missing dog that had walked 40 miles to find its owner. Katie watched it the way everyone else was watching, not really watching, just letting the light and sound fill the space where thoughts might otherwise go. She was 34 years old. She'd served for deployments to Kandahar province. She'd held soldiers' lives together with her hands while rounds came through the walls. She'd broken 17 protocols to save that man in the burn MRAP, and she'd do it again. She'd watched her best friend die because they couldn't get to the aid station fast enough, and that particular haunting had never quite left. And now she was sitting in a waiting room at 6 in the morning, officially unemployed, officially exposed, officially finished with the idea that she could bury her past and just be a normal person who helped people without having to explain which war she'd done it in. The VA waiting room was full of people who understood that. Who got it? Who didn't need the explanation? The relief of that, of finally not being alone in the pretending, was almost as devastating as the loss. The waiting room television flickered, and every veteran's head turned. The breaking news banner cut across the screen in bold red letters: missing Special Forces officer spotted in Colorado Springs. And there Katie's military portrait filled the monitor, her jaw set, her eyes carrying the weight of decisions made in places most people would never see. Captain Katie Rodriguez. Missing 8 months. The Defense Department was requesting information on her whereabouts. A grown man in a wheelchair, his left leg ending at the knee, stared at the screen, then looked directly at Katie sitting 3 chairs down, her hands folded in her lap, her pulse steady as stone. "Captain," he whispered. Not a question. A recognition. A veteran beside him, grey beard, VA hospital bracelet, shoulders curved inward by years of carrying things that had no weight, turned to look. Then another. Within seconds, heads pivoted like compass needles finding true north. A trembling nurse approached Katie with a tablet, her voice barely audible. "Your military file," she said, and began reading aloud as if each word might shatter. "Combat medic. 12 years active duty. 3 deployments to Kandahar. Arrived as a private, left as captain." The nurse's hands shook as she scrolled. Another voice interrupted, deep, calm, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that meant life or death. A Navy SEAL team leader, muscular and scarred, stepped forward from the waiting room crowd. He'd been Katie's patient 6 weeks earlier, treated for shrapnel wounds from an IED that should have killed him. His eyes locked on Katie's face. "Silver Star," he said simply. The room held its breath. 2 bronze stars for Valor in Kandahar. He paused, letting each word land like a precision strike. "I watched you work on me for 7 hours straight. Hands steady as surgical lasers. You didn't just save my life, Captain. You saved 6 other soldiers that night because you stayed calm when everyone else was falling apart." The hospital administrator appeared with 2 FBI agents in dark suits, their presence shifting the air pressure in the room like a storm front moving in. One agent stepped toward Katie, his identification badge catching the fluorescent light. "Captain Rodriguez, we've been searching for you. Your testimony is needed to verify combat medical records in an active war crimes tribunal. The International Criminal Court is prosecuting 3 Taliban field commanders for crimes against medical personnel. Your documentation from Kandahar operations is critical evidence." Katie's expression didn't change. Her composure was like a vault with a door that didn't open for questions or surprises. She simply nodded. And that's when Dr. Blackwell arrived. He pushed through the waiting room doors in his white coat, his face flushed, his eyes scanning the crowd trying to understand the commotion. The moment he saw the FBI agents, the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He tried to smile, a reflex, a failing of his instinct to charm. "I'm sure there's some confusion," he began, his voice taking on that practiced doctor tone, the one that had worked in 1,000 administrative meetings. But before he could finish, a thin man in his 40s stepped forward. Daniel Kershaw. Former Army Signals Intelligence, now working VA Hospital IT. He held up an external hard drive like evidence at trial. "Dr. Blackwell," Kershaw said, his voice flat and professional, "at 4:51 a.m. this morning, you remotely accessed Riverside Community Security System from your home IP address and attempted to delete 73 hours of footage from multiple camera angles. The silence was so thick you could operate in it." Kershaw continued, "I've been monitoring suspicious admin access for 3 weeks. This drive contains every frame you tried to erase, including footage of you altering patient medication records. including your removal of controlled substances from the pharmacy over a 2-year period. He handed the drive to the FBI agent. Blackwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. The agent's expression hardened like concrete setting. Within 72 hours, the State Medical Board launched a formal investigation. The security footage showed everything, every edit to patient charts, every late-night visit to the pharmacy, every controlled substance logged out and never logged back in. The pharmaceutical investigation revealed he'd stolen over $200,000 in oxycodone, fentanyl patches, and hydromorphone. He'd been selling them through a network of compromised pharmacies across 3 states. His attorney negotiated a plea deal, 18 months in federal prison, permanent revocation of his medical license, and a court-ordered provision that upon release, he would work as night security guard at Riverside Community Hospital for 3 years as restitution. The hospital board terminated him the day after his arrest. Colonel Hendricks, the colonel Katie had saved in that parking lot 6 months earlier, personally filed a complaint with the Colorado Medical Society, detailing how Blackwell's hands had fumbled with equipment while a decorated officer hemorrhaged. "She saved my life," the colonel's statement read. He nearly ended it. Every phone call Blackwell had made to destroy Katie's employment prospects was documented. Every email to competing hospitals was forwarded to the state attorney general's office. The walls closed in from every direction, each strategic move he'd made unraveling backward into evidence of consciousness of guilt. His arrogance became his confession. 6 months later, Katie stood in the VA hospital parking lot at sunset, the sky burning orange and gold above the Rocky Mountains. She wore the credentials of head trauma nurse, a position created specifically for her after her testimony helped secure convictions in the tribunal. The tarnished challenge coin hung on her keychain, catching the last light of day, no longer hidden in her wallet but displayed openly, a reminder of what she'd survived and finally reclaimed. Inside the hospital, she'd built a combat trauma training program staffed entirely by veteran medical personnel. The waiting room that had once represented her lowest point, the place where she'd surrendered to her past, now held photographs of lives saved by her team. Names. Faces. Dates. Coordinates. Evidence that she'd transformed her pain into purpose. That evening, she drove back to Riverside Community Hospital on a routine patient transfer. The lobby was the same, beige walls, fluorescent lights humming their artificial song, the smell of antiseptic and floor polish hanging in the air. And there, standing by the metal detectors in a dark blue security guard uniform, was Dr. Blackwell. He'd been there for 2 months, watching decorated veterans receive the care he'd once corrupted, every shift a reminder of his fall. His eyes dropped when Katie passed. She didn't acknowledge him. The elevator doors opened, and 3 nurses greeted her warmly, asking for advice on a complex trauma case involving a former Marine with blast injuries. Katie walked them through the protocol with the quiet authority of someone who'd done this thousands of times. On her way out, a young Air Force medic stopped her, shrapnel scars running down his left arm, his eyes carrying that familiar hollow look she recognized from her own mirror. "Do you know about PTSD resources?" he asked quietly. Katie handed him a card for the VA program, then placed her hand on his shoulder. "It doesn't make you weak to ask for help," she said, her voice steady and sure. "It makes you ready to help others." The medic's eyes welled up. Katie pushed through the front doors into the cool Colorado evening and paused at the exact spot where Blackwell had escorted her out 6 months earlier. Rain had passed through that afternoon, leaving the asphalt dark and gleaming. She spoke to no one in particular, her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd survived. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She walked to her car, the challenge coin swinging from her keys like a metronome marking time, and drove back to the VA where her next shift, and the next soldier who needed saving, was waiting. If you've made it this far, you know the truth. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes you never see coming. Like this video if Katie's journey moved you. And comment, tell me, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to?